Job. Wonderful lesson and just wonderfully presented as well. But we were continuing a series. Actually, today we're wrapping up a series about hope. About hope. And in that series, just to kind of remind you of where we were, we talked about the foundation of hope. What is it that gives us this confidence, this hope? You know, people who live without hope are people who really aren't living. Or people who don't live for long, because hope is often the thing that drives us, keeps us going, gives us or connects us to that purpose and that meaning in life. When you see people who are without hope, you don't see people who are happy people, are joyous people, are people who have the appearance of what we would consider normalcy. These are people who are downtrodden and without purpose and meaning in their lives. So we talked about the foundation of hope. We talked about the end result of hope, that heavenly realm, that place where we go and we can be with God for eternity. And then we even talked about how to get from that beginning of hope, that foundation of hope, to having that hope in heaven. And then, of course, we kind of stopped the series by talking about the resurrection and the hope. Christ paving the way for us into eternity. And hopefully all of that, educating ourselves as to what this hope is and where it leads us and where it comes from and how we get there, will help foster within us the hope that God speaks of in His Word over and over and over again. That confident expectation that transcends the events and the things of this life, but allows us to see that eternity to which we go. But today we want to talk about something that any series on hope would be kind of, well, lacking without. And that is the concept that so many struggle with. The simple idea of losing your hope. Is hope something that can be lost once it is gained? Certainly. There are many in our world who lose hope all the time, who lose that confidence in God, confidence in His Word, confidence in that eternity that is supposed to come, maybe confidence even in their own abilities. We lose that confident expectation in a spiritual sense and are left confused and distraught in this world, seemingly without meaning, seemingly without purpose. There's a movie that we watched last night, my family and I. It's called The Life of Pi. I don't know if you've seen the movie or not. Amazing movie. I normally don't recommend movies, but I'd recommend you see it. You kind of got to ignore some of the things that are in it, but it's just a phenomenal movie. But it's all about this young boy who is in the beginning of his life seeking something. And he lives in India, and his family owns a zoo, and he finally gets to this point where he is seeking and finding, and he finds himself a girlfriend. Lo and behold, the family has to move. Not only are they just moving, they're not moving across town there, they're moving across the world. They have to pick up the animals from the zoo, they have to put them on a boat, and they have to take them to Canada. Take them to Canada. Well, as they're traveling across the Pacific Ocean, the boat wrecks. The boat wrecks and sinks to the bottom, killing his family. And he tells his version of the story. And in his version of the story, he survives. He's the lone survivor in a boat on the ocean with a Bengal tiger, a hyena, a zebra, and an orangutan in this small little lifeboat. Well, the story goes on, and you might figure it out already. 4 become 2 in the boat. 4 become 2 in the boat, and lots of things happen. They suffer through the doldrums, no winds, just sitting on the sea that looks like glass, going nowhere, kind of frying in the sun. They go through these storms that are tossing and turning the boat, and the young boy, Pi, yells out to God. asking God what more he wants from him. And then one time a whale comes crashing out of the waves and lands on top of the raft where he kept all of the supplies, and all the supplies are gone. And it's somewhere about this point of the movie, the boy, Pi, says this. He says, even when God seemed to have abandoned me, he was watching. Even when he seemed indifferent to my suffering, he was watching. And when I was beyond all hope of saving, he gave me rest. Then he gave me a sign to continue my journey. It was funny. I was talking to the kids later about it, and they were sharing their insight and said some wonderful things about the movie, and we batted it back and forth. It's just one of those movies that you almost have to talk about once you're done watching it. Because there's so many little underlying threads that sort of lead you to God and faith and hope and love and all of that it just can't help but get into your heart, and you want to talk about it. But we were talking afterwards, and one of the things that one of the kids said to me was, Josh, he said, you know, when life gives you oranges, you make orange juice. And that's a pretty good interpretation of the movie. And I kind of thought he was done there, but then he says, you know, when life gives you tomatoes, you make tomato juice. Okay. When life gives you carrots, you make carrot juice. All right. And then he said, when life gives you onions, you make onion juice. And I'm thinking, who makes onion juice? You know, but he goes on and he mentions all of these things, and then he looks at me and he says, you know what? If life gives you all of that and more, and I said, you what? He said, you make V8. I thought, well, that's pretty good. That's pretty good because, you know, life does often give us more, does it not? It does. Life throws things at us at times that can be very, very difficult. And I think this context in Genesis is one of those times where, even though we are tempted to read over it so many years later, that it speaks to this kind of desperate plea for man at times to, God, give me hope. Let me not lose grasp of the meaning that you have placed within my life. And we struggle with that. Verse 27 of Genesis 11. Now these are the generations of Terah. Now usually when we read that, most of the time our eyes kind of glaze over because you know what we're in for? We're in for this giant list of names that you can't pronounce, and it just seems to go on forever, right? But tucked in this little context, I think, is this very interesting story. And these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abraham, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred in Ur of the Chaldeans. Now, why does it tell us that? I mean, this is supposed to be a genealogy, a lineage. But for some reason, it brings up this point. And it gives us some really decent specifics here. It says, he died in the presence of his father. He didn't just die. He died and his father witnessed it. His father saw it. In the land of his kindred in the Ur of the Chaldees. And Abraham and Nahor took wives, and the name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, and the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and Iscah. There's all those names you can't pronounce. Now Sarai was barren. She had no child. Now look at verse 31. 31 kind of takes us back in time a little bit. It says, now Terah took Abram, his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Do you think it's a little odd that this fellow has a son by the name of Haran, and he travels to a place named Haran, and he ends up dying there on his way to a place called Canaan, to which one of his sons would go much later in life with those two people who were left behind? Do you not think that's a little odd? Now here's a guy who set out on a journey. And we don't know exactly why. The Bible doesn't spell it out, but it mentions these facts for some reason. If I had my guess, and it's just a guess, Terah was heartbroken over the death of his son. Terah was a guy who had hopes and had dreams and had all the things that, maybe he had wanted. But he had two things that really were going against him at the time. One was the fact that he lived in a land that was full of idolatry. And the other one was his entire family lived there. His entire lineage of people. This is where we're from. This is where we stay. We don't go anywhere. There's no reason for us to go anywhere. So his family's all there, just like Abraham in years to come. Just like Abraham, he leaves his family. He leaves all of these things behind, and there they are in the past, and he moves forward. Terah is interrupted. His life is seemingly shattered at the death of his son that was in his presence. And maybe he decides on his own. And maybe they decide as a family. I don't know. Again, we don't know all the details. But for some reason, they set out on a journey. And I don't think they find a specific place that already has a sign that says, "You are now entering Haran." If I had my guess, they get to a place where Terah's health becomes so bad that they have to stop. And out of respect for the son that had passed away, not being able to reach this land of Canaan, they named the place Haran. But Terah was a guy who struggled. He had hardships, and those hardships were interfering with where he wanted to go and where he wanted to be. And such is the way of our lives. There are places that we want to go. There are things that we want to do. There are folks that we want to know. There are dreams that we have to accomplish. There are expectations that we have of this life. And with God, we can have this great confidence in those expectations at times, but then life sort of interrupts. Life kind of throws a hurdle in our path. And this morning, I want us to talk about just 3 of those hurdles. Because I am a firm believer in, if you know them in advance, you can see them coming and avoid them. A week ago, Max and I, we laid underneath of my truck pretty much all day, taking the gas tank off and replacing the fuel pump. Not an easy job. But we had a video. Had the iPad sitting right there, played the video, and the video was nothing but things that could go wrong. Because you're laying underneath of this tank that's 4 foot long, 18 inches high, and it's full of flammable liquid. You don't want things to go wrong when you're in that situation. So things that can go wrong. I instantly put aside the videos that got the grinder out and were cutting through the bed. So, okay, I can cut through the bed of the truck, but where are the sparks going to go? Well, I don't know. I didn't have any interest in flying that day, so I decided that I was going to watch the video of potential things that could go wrong, and I did. Well, the same thing is true with these types of things. We look at the Bible, and sometimes it's simply a pattern for us to say, here are the things that can go wrong. This leads to this, leads to this, leads to separation with God, so avoid that path. There are hurdles when it comes to hope, and one of those hurdles is very simply changes in life. Changes in life. Now, how many times have we set our plans only to see them take a turn that we never expected? I mean, go in your Bibles over to the book of James. You can hold your place there in Genesis if you want. But go over to the book of James, chapter 4, and read with me verses 14 through 17. Well, 13 through 17. James is writing. James, the half-brother of Christ, says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. And whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. Make your plans. Set your course. But you see, if God is not the final stamp of approval we have on our plans, then perhaps we're heading in the wrong direction. Or what more likely happens is this. We kind of set our plans. We look at God and we look at what he has to say, and we set our plans, and then all of a sudden our plans change. And we see it as a very negative thing. It's something that, this is what we wanted, and I didn't get what I wanted, and it's moved me in this other direction, and this was good, and now this is bad. And how many times has that ever happened to you? I'm going this way, but when it changed, I went from good to bad, only to find out that the bad was actually better than the good that I had originally set out to do. Anybody ever have that happen? I mean, it's happened to me plenty of times. And it's all just simply a matter of perception. God is changing our way, and God is setting the course. And if we just simply acknowledge that and we're open to it, then we can understand. We can understand in advance that God controls the kingdoms of men just as well as he controls our personal lives. I mean, look at Abram himself, the descendant, the son of Terah. Terah has his plans changed, his life interrupted, so to speak. But then Abram has the same thing. I mean, go back and just look at the whole promised son aspect of Abram's life. I mean, he waits and he waits and he waits, and it's certainly not what God expected. And, he tries to do it his own way and expects God to bless him for it, and God doesn't. And he says, you're going to have to wait. And then he gives him a son, and finally, once he gives him that son, he tells him, take him to the top of the mountain and kill him. How's that work out? Well, Abram had faith. Abraham had confidence enough in God to go ahead and walk that path. And the Bible never indicates any way, shape, or form that he complained, that he groaned, that he grumbled. He just simply went and did it. Just like James says, we ought to say, if God wills. Of course, when he says that, he's referring to the course that we set and the proactivity that we have to have in it. We can't ascribe God's will to something as an afterthought. Oh, that was good, so that must be God's will. I think this is bad, so that must not be God's will. Sometimes things that God does for us don't always look as if they are beneficial for us. Does not the New Testament tell us that God chastises every single one of his children that he loves? And that's all of us. And that chastisement does not seem pleasant for a time, but bears great results. Well, sure, it says that. Does not Romans tell us that God works all things to the good who love him? He doesn't say that you will perceive everything that God does for you as being good. Never says that at all. What he's saying there in the book of Romans chapter 8 and verse 28 is that God is going to do what's best for you whether you like it or not. Whether you see it as a good thing or a bad thing, God is going to do it for you. And if that means you've got to learn a hard lesson about patience, if that means you've got to learn a hard lesson about being angry, if that means you've got to learn the hard lesson about some aspect of your life, then that's the place that God's going to take you. It was interesting, watching that movie again last night. There is that scene where they're in the middle of the storm. And the young man, thinking everything has been taken from him, stands on the top of the boat and yells, "What more do you want from me, God?" And the answer very well could have been, "I want you to learn the lesson that I'm trying to teach you." How many times do we stand on the top of our boat and cry out to God as we're struggling with our hope, our confidence, our faith, wanting the lesson, when in all actuality, we're living the lesson. God, give me an answer. Why? Well, you're in the middle of my answer. Take it. Take the good and live with it. The second thing that can sometimes interfere with our hope, our confidence, is circumstances. Circumstances. Now, sometimes life changes, and of course, those are circumstances and they change. But more specifically, our situation, things that are perhaps outside of our control, present themselves. For instance, if we could all control the health of our physical bodies, would anybody here get old? Would you wake up with pain in your knees every morning, or whatever it is that you wake up with, or that shoulder that won't work, or the eyes that don't see quite right, or the hair that you see in the whatever, you know what I'm saying? I mean, most of us would not choose those things. These are just simply circumstances in life, things that are perhaps beyond our control. Sometimes these are the things that rattle our faith, that shake our faith, that take our hope from us. But they need not take that hope. Evil objects to our hope and seeks to crush it, however, using many tools in the world. Many are the people who cry out at the passing of a loved one, or the entrance into a circumstance that, though unstoppable, certainly brings great heartache and great trauma. We cry out to God. You've probably never heard of a guy by the name of Brooks Behringer. Brooks Behringer was a second-string quarterback for Nebraska who had very few chances to play during his college years, because he played behind another talented individual called Tommy Frazier. And Tommy Frazier was the star quarterback for the team. Tommy Frazier was the one who got all of the attention, but one time, Tommy Frazier injured his knee, and he couldn't play. So this fellow by the name of Brooks Behringer, he finally gets in the game, finally gets to play. And in this one game, does such a stellar job that he gets the attention of scouts. And lo and behold, even though he wasn't the star of the team, when he is going to graduate, he is set to go to the NFL draft. Set to go to the NFL draft. The Thursday before he was supposed to be drafted into the NFL, he got in a plane, flew over Lincoln, Nebraska, and then witnesses watched as that plane made a left turn, banked, flipped over, and then pounded into the ground, killing all of the people inside. Here's what his mother had to say. We were going to watch him get drafted. Everybody was ready. Well, on Thursday of this week, he was drafted by a higher team. Hope. Life circumstances shouldn't rob us of the hope that we have, because our hope is not in the situations and the circumstances of this world. You go over to Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3, written by Paul to a group of Christians. Says this: if then you have been raised with Christ, okay, raised with Christ, there's that hope. Christ raised from the dead, you have hope. You've been raised from the dead too. Deadness of the old life to the newness of this new life, being transformed to the image of his Son, and then ultimately going to go and spend that eternity with him. If you have been raised with Christ, seek those things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things that are above, not on the things that are on the earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ who is in your life appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you. And he goes on to list a bunch of things. Those circumstances, those situations, those earthly constructs that kind of frame our life should not be things that rob us of our hope. Take away our confidence. And then number 3, sometimes it's our choices. Sometimes, almost without even knowing it, we make the choice to have no hope by the choices that we make in life. Sometimes hope and dreams die due to the things that we take on. You see, hope takes work. Hope takes work, as we've seen in the entirety of the series of lessons. And often we run out of energy. We run out of energy, we lie down spiritually, and by choice give up the race. You see, Paul talks about that in Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Paul says this. He says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, those who have gone before, those who are experiencing the fulfillment of that hope, let us also lay aside every weight." You see, there's some of those circumstances, those situations. "And sin which so closely, or clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God." Sometimes we just get tired and we choose not to run. Because it takes work to have hope. It takes effort. It takes study. It takes meditation. It takes prayer. It takes work. Sometimes we lose focus. It's not as if we're giving up. It's not as if we fail to endure. We just kind of get off focus. I remember once hearing the story about this pack of bloodhounds that were chasing after, the fox in one of those fox hunts, right? Okay. The fox takes off, and then all of a sudden, a wild pig comes by them, and they pick up the scent of the wild pig, and they end up following, the wild pig, and then pretty soon, a rabbit comes by, and they pick up the scent of the rabbit, and they take off after the rabbit, and then pretty soon, a mouse comes by, and they pick up the scent of the mouse, and they follow the mouse. So what started off as a fox hunt ends up at a mouse hole. And sometimes Christians are that way. We set our sights on Christ and God and heaven, and we end up at the mouse hole. Someplace we ought not be because we lose our focus. Sometimes it's our failure. We look back on our lives and we say, well, I failed then, I'm just going to fail in the future. Why have hope? Why have hope? There's a guy by the name of William Tyndale. Wanted to print an English version of the Bible. Church found out about it. Catholic Church found out about it. And they began to persecute him. Tried to throw him into prison. Put a bounty on his head. Imagine that. Imagine that. The supposed body of Christ takes out a hit, basically, on this guy who all he wants to do is give the Bible in the people's language. So he hid out here and there, and for 11 years, every day, very little sleep, works on that version of the Bible. And in 11 years' time, at the same time studying the Hebrew, at the same time studying the Greek, he ends up producing this Bible. We have to endure. And we can't let our failure force us to give it up. There was a guy by the name of Charles Schultz. Anybody not know the name Charles Schultz? A guy by the name of Charles Schultz graduated high school barely. Barely. Grades barely good enough to get him out of high school. He describes himself as this geeky-looking character with a really bad complexion. whose original cartoons he submitted to the newspaper at his high school. And at the high school level, they said, these are horrible. We're not going to publish them. Now imagine that. I mean, he gets rejected. And yet this is the same guy who goes on to have his cartoons published, including the lovable loser Charlie Brown, all over the world. And perhaps one of the most famous cartoonists there was. Why? Because he didn't give up. He didn't let his past failure lead his future, but instead let the potential and the hope he had lead him. There's one more point that we need to make. Some dreams die. Some hopes, some expectations perish because they're supposed to. Not everything that we expect, not everything that we want, not everything that we can dream up are things that God has in mind for us. Some things God knows we are better without. And even though when they are taken from us, they are very painful, they're not part of who we're supposed to be. Most of us in the course of our lives will struggle with hope, just as we struggle with faith. Just as we struggle with a lot of things. Life in general can be a struggle. But if we know the hurdles in advance, if we know that God is with us, and can help us rise above the situations and circumstances, help us make the right choices, if we're willing to do the work, then we can continue and have that hope that allows us to exist in this world with the greatest happiness and gladness, rejoicing, singing His praises forever and always. Perhaps you need to find the relationship with Him today that leads to that hope. You need to heed the invitation's call, which says very simply this: come. You've studied that word. You know what to do. You understand that it talks about faith and the necessity of having that strength of conviction. And you know that strength of conviction is leading you to do something about that sin that is part of your life. First by changing perspective, and then by changing your life. And what we call repentance. Confess His name today. Enter the waters of baptism. Allow Him to wash you clean, so you can rise to walk in newness of life. Or maybe you simply need to return, having found your hope in Him once more. The invitation then is for you as together we stand and sing.